Welcome to MEGJC 101, a podcast about the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation and our contribution to building a resilient Jamaica. I'm your host, Danny Clark. Come, look we talk. Welcome to this wonderful episode of MEGJC 101 as we bid a fond farewell to the wonderful year that was 2023. We're here to sprinkle some holiday cheer into our last podcast of the season. But fear not, for this is not goodbye. It's simply a see you next year. As we eagerly await the arrival of 2024, let's wrap up the year with the final installment of our housing portfolio series as we explore the heart of tenant support, the Rent Services Unit. Today, we'll be having a conversation with Senior Inspector in the Rent Services Unit, Mrs. Nadia Preddy. So get ready to unwrap valuable insights and share in the holiday spirit as we discuss the ins and outs of room for rent apply within. But first, a word from our sponsors.
Through its agencies, the government is reshaping urban centers through park upgrades, community enhancement, and beautification projects. Sidewalk repairs create safer and more pedestrian-friendly streets. And families are coming together in newly transformed parks and public spaces. We're committed to building a safe and secure future for all.
The Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, building hope, building Jamaica.
Welcome back, and we go straight into our interview with Mrs. Nadia Preddy. All right, so Ms. Preddy, to start things off, could you provide our listeners with an overview of the Rent Services Unit and what are your primary roles and functions?
Okay, sure, most certainly. So the Rent Services Unit is the Secretariat of the Rent Assessment Board. The Rent Services Unit also falls under the umbrella of the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. Hence, what it means is that the Rent Services Unit reports to the Rent Assessment Board and also the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. Now, primarily, our role really is to settle disputes between landlords and tenants.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Preddy. So we now understand that the Rent Services Unit is somewhat of a secretariat to the Rent Assessment Board. All right. What are some of the services that you offer to the public?
Okay, so some of the services, we're going to start with the commercial properties, where we grant exemptions to commercial properties once they meet the criteria. Mm-hmm. We also do registration of properties, and we also offer services of hearings. For example, if a tenant is owing rent, the landlord can come to the rent board and sue to recover those arrears of rent. Mm-hmm. Now, we have been doing these hearings in Kingston, and we have high plans to continue these kind of hearings in our regional offices, namely Clarendon, Westmoreland, St. James, and St. Anne.
Okay, wonderful. You mentioned something about exemption for commercial buildings. What does that mean?
Right. So if a landlord has a commercial property, now usually our assessment officer will make a determination based on the criteria that they would have applied under. Yes. So if they meet the criteria, then an exemption is granted.
What exempted from?
Right. So they are exempted from rent control, whereby basically they can increase their rent above 7.5% without being penalized.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. All right. Could you then state some of the essential documents that people need to take with them when seeking assistance as it relates to rent-related matters?
So we normally encourage the parties to take their contracts or their lease agreement, their rent receipts or their receipt books, and their bills, utility bills. Right. So those are the things that they would need to take to us.
Okay. So once I'm a landlord, I need to take my receipt book.
Yes.
And what else you say again?
You need to take your contract that you would have had in place with your tenant.
The tenant.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And if it's a matter that you're trying to get some resolution with utility bills, you need to take those bills as well.
All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty for tenants. What are the key things they should be aware of regarding rent, and what rights do they have when renting?
Right. So we always encourage our tenants, once you're going to rent a property, make sure that you physically go to the property. Check all the switches, the water faucets. If it's a case that you'll be sharing utility bills, please ensure that you get a copy of those bills so you are in a mindset as to what you're putting yourself into.
What are some of the issues, though, that you find that people, some of the things that people don't look out for, and so unexpectedly they turn up to the rent services unit with these issues? So, for example, you just mentioned, make sure you check the light switch or you check your the utility. What are some of the things that you find that people just say, I'm just renting a place, so I'm just gonna go there. Once it looks nice and it looks clean, then I'm good.
Right. So what I find is that some people are very gullible. So they're renting a space. Landlord say, okay, it's 50,000 including light and water. Now, I mean, it depends on where you are, and you know within yourself, light and water cannot be included in a rent for $50,000. That's just ridiculous. So in that case, we'd encourage the tenants, just check with the landlord. May I see your last water bill? May I see your last light bill? Just to verify that, yes, this is really possible. Now, in addition to that, we find is that a number of tenants, they rent a 2-story house. And that is why we encourage both parties to have a lease agreement to stipulate the terms and conditions of the lease. For example, you have cases where the tenant rents a property, the tenant decide to purchase a vehicle, and then they need to park on the property. Now, what you find is that sometimes a landlord really is not in agreement with that, and it poses a problem. So we encourage the parties, whatever it is that is needed at the property, it's best that you make sure that you put it in writing to avoid the 2-story of rental.
But suppose I don't have it in my mind yet to buy the car, right? And then somewhere along the line, I'm able to purchase a car. Can that lease agreement be amended to include the whole parking situation on the compound?
Most certainly, it can be amended to do that. And we encourage the parties, please, to communicate, because sometimes too, that bring to a situation where the landlord might want to increase the tenant's rent because okay, this tenant now come with a car, so of course this tenant can pay some more money, so they want to increase the tenant's rent.
Oh wow.
Oh yes.
So what are my rights under that now when I come to the rent services unit? How you help me with that?
Right. So under the Rent Restriction Act, the landlord can ask for an increase, but the increase means that the tenant would have to be at the property for at least 12 months. Now, the increase that a landlord can legally charge is 7.5%. Anything over that is considered as an illegal increase. Now, the situation differs. So, say, for example, the landlord would have created some significant improvements to the property. Then the landlord now can ask for an increase above that, but they would have to do so at the rent board by submitting their rent receipts for the assessment officer to make that determination.
Okay, interesting stuff. All right, so now conversely, we're going to be talking about landlords. What are the crucial responsibilities they should be mindful of when leasing or renting their premises?
So it is important that landlords really ought to do proper checks of their prospective tenants. It's advisable that you just don't rent to someone because they come to your property with 3 months rent in advance. It could possibly mean that this person just get their partner draw, and then the next month or two, the landlord cannot collect his rent. So we advise the landlords, please ensure that you do your checks on these tenants to make sure that they can pay the rent on the due date of the rental.
Okay, I noticed that persons, nowadays, persons ask for like bank statements, they ask for job letters to show some form of security. That is legal, right?
Okay, well, the legality of it, I don't want to get into that aspect, but I always encourage the tenants, if you're not comfortable with giving up too much of your information, move on to the next prospective property.
All right, so Miss Preddy, we know that the rent services unit is a very dynamic place and you see new clients every day. What are some of the challenges that your clients encounter?
Some of the most challenges, for example, the tenants, they remove from the property and the landlord refuse to return their security deposits. Some other challenges, the landlords, on the other hand, the tenant don't want to pay their rent, and what they sometimes do is to do things illegally. And I guess they're trying to take the law into their own hands. For example, they might decide that they're going to just cut off the light because the tenant is not paying the rent. Yes. Or sometimes they probably take off the doors or take off the windows. Yes. So those are some of the things that some tenants really have to go through when they and their landlords are not on the same page.
There should never be a dull moment in your work life. Wow. All right. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to address now some common concerns, right? Can individuals pursue legal action for rent issues?
Most certainly. And that is why we have our hearings twice per month. And these hearings address matters pertaining to landlords who are unable to collect their rents from the tenants. So they can come to the rent board and sue for their rent. Also, the tenants, on the other hand, they can sue to get back their security deposits if the landlord refuses to return it after 30 days of them moving from the property. And there are also cases where the greedy landlords decide to increase their rent above the 7.5%. They also can sue to recover those illegal increases that the landlord would have charged them.
Okay, when you say sue, what does that look like? Sue me for like millions of dollars and I get it? Is that like that?
So, okay, so suing is very simple. And some landlords are not aware that once the tenant is owing rent for 30 days or more, they can come and take out that summons. So what it means is that our inspectors would go out, serve this summons on the parties to attend our hearing. Now, we encourage the parties, please acknowledge these documents because they are legal, and our court is quasi-judicial in its ruling. So it has the same power as if it was done at the parish court. So we encourage the parties, please make sure that you come. You can take an attorney, but you don't have to. It's a civil matter, so both parties can represent themselves. Now, also, if it is now that there are damages, they would have to go by the parish court to sue for that.
Okay, all right. So I just want to clarify now because I don't want anybody to think that they can go and sue and then they get this one whole heap of money, as how I thought. So, so if I'm owed 3 months rent and that comes to, let's say, $100,000, once the case is in my favor, then I can get that 100,000. If the light bill, water bill, internet, cable, if that was a part of it, and I'm in arrears, or the tenant is in arrears for, let us say, another 500,000, then I collect my $600,000 and I put out, and my tenant has to leave my property, and then I'm good to go. That's how it goes.
Yes, but you have to be mindful. If it is that you want the tenant to leave, you would have to issue a notice in writing for the tenant to vacate.
Oh, so once I'm suing them, it doesn't let them not understand that they have to leave? Is that so?
No.
Okay.
And as you mentioned that aspect of it too, what we find too is that when persons have a lease agreement and the lease expire, some landlords just believe that the tenant should just go because they didn't renew the lease. It doesn't work like that. Tenant, no, it now becomes a month-to-month tenant. So if it is that they don't want the tenant at the expiry date of the notice, at the expiry date of the lease, I beg your pardon, they would still have to give a notice for the tenant to vacate. Yes, and it must be in writing. So you can't stay overseas and WhatsApp me a notice.
Oh,
certainly not.
So technology don't work in this
instance?
Okay.
No.
Okay, so I have to physically type out the notice, print it, sign it, and if I'm in foreign, I have to send it via mail.
Not only that, but if it's advisable if you are not in the island, then you should appoint someone to act on your behalf. And appointing this person, you would give them what is called a power of attorney.
Oh, okay.
Yes, and this power of attorney must be stamped where you are in the foreign country and signed
notary
by
public.
the notary public, right? And then when it comes here in Jamaica, it has to be stamped at the stamp office and registered at the RGD's office.
So, Ms. Brady, this is very important information because, now with the age of technology, WhatsApp, you want something to get done, you send the person a WhatsApp. But no, you're saying this is a legal matter. So not only must the notice be given in writing, but if I'm living overseas and I'm unable to come to Jamaica to have this letter delivered to the person, I have to now find someone who I trust, send that letter to the person, have them become my power of attorney, go through the whole process of the whole, stamp office, RGD bit before that notice can be served. This is a serious matter. Security deposits are a standard practice in renting. What rules govern the return of security deposits, and under what circumstances should tenants expect to receive them back?
Right. So once a tenant vacates the property, they would have given their 30 days notice within their rental period of their intention to leave. They hand over their keys before the due date. They created no damages to the property. They paid all their bills. They should get back their security deposit in full. Now, if there are cases where the landlord would have identified any issues, then this should be communicated to the tenant, preferably in writing. Now, if there are bills to be covered, the receipts should be sent to them as well for them to be aware of what the security deposit is being held for, or a portion of that. Yes.
What if the landlord gave the tenant permission to, let us say, when the service providers are coming in and they need to drill a hole in the wall to run the cables? What if the landlord gave the tenant the permission to do that, and then when the tenant is now moving, the landlord is requesting that the tenant pays the bill to fix back the hole?
And that is why we encourage both parties. Please ensure that whatever decisions are being taken, they are put in writing and the parties sign to it. Because this now will take away from the whole story of renting a property.
Evictions can be challenging and a challenging and sensitive topic. What's the protocol for handling evictions, and when do they become null and void for tenants, and what requirements must both parties fulfill in this process?
All right, so evictions normally is within the court, the ambit of the court, usually when a notice is given to a tenant. Now, if everything on the notice is not in order, then this notice will be null and void. So say, for example, the rent is due on the 1st of the month, but the landlord is asking the tenant to leave on the 15th of next month. Now, that notice will be null and void. Right. So the notice must be written where then it must expire a day before the next rent is due, but it must be 30 days or more. Also, the notice must entails the reason why it is that the landlord is asking for the tenant to vacate the property. Of course, the landlord must ensure that they sign the notice and also ensure that they put on the date when the notice was given to this tenant. Now, after the expiration of the notice, if the tenant doesn't find suitable accommodations and the landlord really wants to get this tenant out, the landlord would have to go to the parish court and apply for recovery of possession. That's the time when the judge will make an order for the tenant to vacate. And after the date that the court makes, if the tenant doesn't vacate from the property, then that's the time the landlord will now file for a formal order, and then the eviction can take place.
So, Ms. Brady, now I understand why you have these challenges of people taking off windows and doors and padlock and cutting off lights, because this process is quite long. If I have a tenant who is giving me problems, I don't want the tenant to stay in there. There's no easier way to get around this thing than to go through all of that long thing that you just mentioned a while ago. No other way?
Certainly not. But just be mindful, landlords and tenants, they have their rights and they also have their responsibilities. Now, if the landlord decides to take things into his or her own hands, there are consequences. Because under the Rent Restriction Act 27, it says that if any landlord or his agent interfere with the peaceful and quiet enjoyment of a tenant and the tenant decides to take this matter to the parish court, and the court finds this landlord guilty of the offense of harassment, the landlord can be locked up in jail for up to a period of 12 months.
Okay, so is there anywhere in the Act, maybe at around section 27, subsection A, maybe, or B, where it says the peace of mind of the landlord?
No, there is no such thing of that nature. The landlord is supposed to go to the parish court. And that is why we're here for all landlords and tenants. If you want a peace of mind before it reaches to that stage, please contact us.
I'm going to segue now into harassment. You just spoke about it, but let's go further into it. How is it that the rent services unit address cases of harassment between landlords and tenants?
Okay, so what we normally do is to ensure that we make contact with the other party. So whatever complaint is coming to us, we try and make contact with the person on our phones, through emails, WhatsApp, whatever means. We try as best as possible to make contact with them, to educate them about the Rent Restriction Act, inform them about the prospective breach that they might be doing. Now, what we find is that sometimes some of the landlords, they will comply, but then there are others who are very stubborn and who believes that they know the law and they'll just continue to break the law. So in those cases, what we do is we prepare a letter, address it to the police, and if that does not resolve, we also have the tenant visit the parish court to have the matter addressed.
Okay, so you know of any instances where a big fight broke and so?
Yes.
Oh wow.
We have had cases, so many cases of that nature.
Okay, this rent restriction situation is very deep. And rental matter, and I think that we have a lot more to talk about. We have limited time today, but I do believe that we need to have a part 2 in this conversation, because I know that there must be some very pressing issues that landlords and tenants face, and some issues too that when they come to you, you're trying to figure out in this new day and age how it is that you are to get over this hurdle, in keeping, of course, with the law and with the Rent Restriction Act. Question: what jurisdiction do you have over strata apartments that are within a strata unit?
Right. Usually those strata complexes, it depends on what the situation is. For example, most of the stratas, what we realize is that, for example, water is a part of the whole strata complex. So tenants, it depends on the arrangements that they're having with their landlords. It's a case sometimes what you find too, in addition to the tenants owing, you find that the property owner, who's the landlord, is owing, and oftentimes that affects the tenant having access or just having the services that they would have paid for. And usually what we realize, it's a strata corporation who can assist them to have that resolved.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Well, Miss Pretty, thank you for joining us today. I'm sure that our listeners are quite informed and quite adequately so too. And I look forward to talking with you again because I want to hear about some of those stories. All right. So thank you for joining us on MEGJC 101. Now, let's add a dash of holiday spirit as we recap the year. We've covered a lot in our podcast this year, and we want to hear from the MEGJC team. So, Team MEGJC, share with us some of the achievements or something that stood out to you from our podcast this year.
All right, so the achievement that stood out for me this year is the completion of the highways works done by NWA, as well as some of the waterworks that has been done by the ministry, and of course the various tours that our minister Simona would have went on. I really love that, and I also love that the completion of some of the houses for the NSHP. Yeah, man.
One of my most memorable moments here at MEGJC was our sports day. We had such a wonderful time that day, and I saw where we all come out and gel together. I mean, we had a beautiful, beautiful moment.
My most memorable moment is hearing about the zinc fence removal program, and hope to see it actually manifesting in different communities across Jamaica.
My most memorable moment from the podcast is learning about the legal services unit and what they do. I didn't know that they did so much, and currently I am thinking about getting my title soon.
Right. So I like the fact that the podcast spoke about urban renewal projects. That is the work that I am directly involved in the ministry, and to see it highlighted, give me some sense of joy and pride.
Thank you for joining us in the finale of MEGJC 101 for 2023. We hope you've unwrapped valuable insights into the rent services unit in today's episode. If the festive spirit has sparked any questions, don't be a silent night. Drop your comments on our social media pages, and we'll be like old Saint Nick, delivering answers in our next episode. Remember to slay those follow, like, share, and subscribe buttons on X, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at MEGJC_JM. As we jingle all the way to the end of this year, it's time to bid adieu for now. I'm your host, Danny Clark, wishing you a joyous holiday season and reminding you to walk good. On behalf of our production team right here at MEGJC, until we meet again in the new year, happy holidays.